It's that jolly time of year again, my girlfriend's favorite time of the year, in fact. Second Christmas. Eurovision. I've never really been a Eurovision guy, I say at the beginning of my second Eurovision video essay, but I've grown quite fond of the tradition of watching it with my girlfriend. It's quite enjoyable, you know? A delightfully weird melting pot of disparate European cultures, complete with comedy, song, dance, and highly complex and ancient ethnic divisions, all wrapped up in an unapologetic pro-queer package. There's a lot to love, but then there's the thing. That thing we aren't supposed to mention at Eurovision because it's impolite and, gasp, political. And the EBU, the organizer of Eurovision, frowns on that because they insist that Eurovision, the gayest show ever, is apolitical. That thing I am talking about is, of course, the cheese.
You know what else was sehr lecker?
It's very good.
The first semi-final. Let's have a look at everyone who was here on Tuesday.
No, it's the genocide. It's the genocide of the Palestinian people, and the role Eurovision is made to play in the genocide when Israel, the fascist apartheid state doing the genocide, is welcomed into the fold and allowed to compete in the spirit of inclusivity as if it weren't currently bombing and starving children in what should accurately be described as a genocide. Did I say genocide enough times? I think I can squeeze in a few more times. Yeah. I made a pretty good video last year about the train wreck Eurovision 2024 became by bending itself out of shape and compromising every value it previously held just to allow Israel, the fascist apartheid state currently doing a genocide, to participate. I figured rather naively that maybe with every dead child that it would eventually become unimaginable for Israel to be allowed to compete again. But it turns out that we live in the goddamn Twilight Zone, and the entire Western media ecosystem is either too cowardly to call a spade or too racist to care about dead children that don't look enough like them. Hell, they're still pretending history began on October 7th, and that what Israel is doing is a war against Hamas, and not a genocide of the Palestinian people, whom Israel has oppressed many, many decades before October 7th. They all pretend that objective journalism means that there's two equally valid sides to genocide and that you must present both. And the EBU, which organizes Eurovision, is not any different. So Israel was allowed to compete this year too, and this dark cloud hanging over the event, the implicit normalization of an actual genocide, cast a horrible shadow over the festivities, just like it did the year before. So, let's break it down and talk about Eurovision, past, present, and future, with a focus on this year's event, Eurovision 2025, against the backdrop of the undeniable genocide that cannot be ignored. There's a lot to be said about Eurovision 2025. Like in 2024, the competition's every misstep can be traced back to the one decision to let a regime currently engaged in a genocide participate against all common sense and humanity. I said exactly those words last year, and it's just as true now. And that's a shame because in a vacuum, there was a lot to love about the show last year, and there was even more to love this year. Co-host Hazel Brugger kind of stole the show with all that cheese eating and those hilarious hijinks.
Dag Floor, tack. Hur mår du idag? Yes, this is also a language, apparently, I heard. Because I always look grumpy. I have resting grumpy face, because children are watching. And next to you, I look so friendly. Look at me. Yes. And I think I can hear the Spanish commentator saying, "Ay, caramba!"
Absolutely endearing stuff, and I mean that genuinely. There were plenty of really interesting songs like Estonia's Espresso Macchiato that certainly made headlines, especially in Italy. Or Armenia's Parg, whose song Survivor I thought sounded like an Imagine Dragons song. And that I'm mentioning here because maybe it's relevant somehow to the main thesis of this video essay. To borrow an H-bomb joke,
foreshadowing is a literary device and
also, the audacity of Icelandic Vibe to do a mic drop, a frickin' mic drop, after whatever the hell that was. Mic drops used to mean something. You can't just do a mic drop. You have to do something fantastic, something jaw-dropping to earn that mic drop. You can't just... I guess as a Swede, I should mention Kai's Bara Bara Bastu too, because they're Finnish, even though they competed for Sweden. That would make up for how we stole Finland's victory in 2023. Sorry about that. I guess it's a decent song, pretty funny if you understand the weird ethnic tensions that exist between Swedes and Finns, or at the very least if you are aware of any Finnish stereotypes, and also understand Swedish, the language in which it was performed. Honestly, it's not my favorite song, especially not since it was found out that they purchased pre-made assets to make it, like an actual asset flip of a song. Yikes. But no, my favorite song was probably, I'm not sure I had a favorite song this year. Austria's JJ with his song Wasted Love was very impressive and a worthy winner, if a smidge high-cultured. But there wasn't really a song that stuck out to me in the way Keria or Baby Lasagna did the last 2 years. Speaking of which, the absolute high point of the evening was obviously the medley performance by Keria and Baby Lasagna, two fantastic artists who, sure as Eurovision is apolitical, know how to deliver. No, they actually know how to deliver. Now that we've gotten all the fun stuff out of the way, well, some of it, and I've proven my Eurovision chops, or at the very least given all the Eurovision fans out there something to make fun of me for in the comments, let's talk about what actually matters. After all, it's hard to enjoy all those enjoyable things when all of it exists in the shadow of Israel's crimes against humanity, when there's a pile of dismembered bodies scattered across the event. Wait. Can a pile be scattered? Wouldn't be a pile anymore. It's hard to enjoy all those enjoyable things when there are dismembered bodies scattered across the event. Metaphorically, of course, because the actual dismembered bodies are in Gaza, far enough away that the festivities drown out the bombs and the cries of death, far enough away that we can pretend it's okay for an evening. Sully's licking herself down there. I don't know if the mic can pick that up. She's so freaking adorable. I'm gonna take a photo of her right now, and then I'm gonna insert that up, there. It's hard to, goddamn, it's hard to know which way is which when you record yourself. Okay, let's see. I'm taking a photo now of her lying on my little bag in the corner. She really likes lying on this bag that I just put there because I'm lazy, and then I've just left it there because she deserves everything that she loves and more, you know? The EBU, the European Broadcasting Union, the institution that organizes Eurovision, and the institutional embodiment of both sidesing genocide, or maybe it should be the institutional embodiment of depoliticizing genocide. Yeah. Didn't really learn their lesson from last year's fiasco. If they had, they'd have banned Israel, and Eurovision could have once more been the festival of love and inclusivity that they want it to be, that it should be. But I bet they think they learned their lesson because they did put on a better show and managed to avoid some of the many pitfalls they fell into last year. There wasn't any big scandal like there was in 2024 with Just, who got into it with Israel's Eden Golan during a press conference and shortly thereafter was promptly disqualified for allegedly having done something to a photographer. I was never really clear on what he was alleged to have done, but clearly there was urgency in wanting him removed. Like, did he gesture at a photographer? Did he push them? Did he nudge their camera to the side? Whatever. Get out of here, used. It's not like he did something acceptable like genocide. Meanwhile, last year, several artists also alleged that the Israeli delegation had been harassing them, and absolutely nothing came of that, except a bland statement by the EBU that said they oppose harassment. And that settled my nerves, let me tell you. What I needed to know was that the EBU is against bad things and for good things. Phew, now I don't feel as bad about all the dead kids in Gaza. I didn't see any stories like that this year, but if you did, share in the comments below. The EBU kept a tighter grip on the artists, none of whom made a big fuzz. They weren't allowed to carry any flags other than their respective country flags, and there was no performer this year who spoke truth to power. Nobody like in 2024 when Bambi Thug had Ogham? Apparently Ogham in Old Irish and Ogham in Modern Irish, and who cares about English? So in 2024, Bambi Thug had painted Ogham runes on their skin that translated into the words ceasefire and freedom for Palestine. Last year, there was also XIII, who chose to show up wearing a Palestinian keffiyeh to show support for the Palestinian people, his people on his father's side. After being criticized by the EBU and SVT, the Swedish national broadcaster that arranged Eurovision 2024, Saade shot back by accusing them of racism and for making his ethnicity political, and he was absolutely correct. As I said in last year's video, quote, the EBU, I'm quoting myself now. Quote, the EBU has accepted the logic of bigotry and made the existence of Palestinians themselves political, in the exact same way that the far right has made the existence of LGBTQ people political, end quote. Man, that's a good quote. Whoever said that must be a genius. Nobody pulled a stunt like that this year, to my sincere disappointment, although outside of the show, both this year's winner JJ and last year's winner Nemo have said they think Israel shouldn't be allowed to compete. The show was very clean, at least aesthetically, certainly not ethically. It went very well. If not for the audience bringing Palestinian flags and booing Israel, you wouldn't even know something was amiss. Of course, like last year, the EBU is alleged to have used anti-booing software to clean up the broadcast just a smidge, sanitize the show, you know? Could have been embarrassing for them otherwise, but a point in the EBU's favor is that they kept a looser grip on the audience this year, allowed them to bring Palestinian flags to the event. It's not enough, but certainly an improvement over last year. Even though they banned artists from carrying the pride flag just so they could also ban them from carrying the Palestinian flag without being accused of hypocrisy, almost as if they've internalized the far-right argument that both LGBTQ people and Palestinian people are political. Hey, any ideas on how to make the queer show less political? Keep the state doing the genocide, but ban the pride flag. Oh, alright. Great, thanks. No more praise, because the EBU really isn't praiseworthy. It's a disgusting institution that is rotten to the core. I probably wouldn't have said that a few years ago, because I am very much in favor of public service broadcasting, but the EBU's cowardly whitewashing of some of the worst crimes against humanity this side of the Holocaust just cannot ever be forgiven, and they've consistently made every wrong decision imaginable to justify this unjustifiable position. For example, they kept a short leash on journalists this year. In order to be accredited and be able to properly do their jobs, journalists were made to sign a code of conduct promising not to publish any content deemed, quote, defamatory or damaging to the image and reputation of any contestant, the ESC, the EBU, the host broadcaster, and or of the participating broadcasters, end quote. Damaging? Like the allegation of complicity in genocide, perchance? It's very funny that the EBU even thinks there is any positive image of the EBU to be damaged, right? Like, they've already destroyed it on their own, the fools. Eurovision fans hate the EBU, because of course they do. Eurovision is the wokest shit ever and absolutely slaps because of it, but the EBU is destroying it by allowing Israel to sanitize its image through it. Anyway, the EBU also denied accreditation to longtime Eurovision correspondent, Szymon Stelmajic. I love living in Europe so much. All the names I never know how to pronounce. Stelmajic has reported on Eurovision for 20 years and runs the Eurovision Facebook page Let's Talk About ESC. Yet, he was denied accreditation this year, which I'm sure had nothing to do with the fact that he asked Eden Golan an adversarial question last year, as any good journalist does. He told SVT that it's clearly about revenge, although I think the real reason he was denied accreditation for the first time in 20 years has more to do with the EBU's desire to control the narrative. They didn't want to invite anyone who could rock the boat or, quote, damage the image of the EBU, end quote, by asking awkward questions. They desperately wanted to avoid the PR disaster that comes with openly embracing a genocidal regime. The irony is that this is a political action from the institution that claims it wants Eurovision to be apolitical. Denying access to journalists whose reporting you don't like is a political act. And I bet Stelmajic wasn't the only journalist who was denied access on these political grounds. And if I were complicit in one of the worst crimes of our time, I guess I would do the same thing, probably. I'd want journalists who write fluff pieces and ask about the artist's cute hairstyles, not journalists who ask about all the blood the whole thing's drenched in. Even though the event itself came across as pretty clean, as I said before, news reporting was, thankfully, still framed by the opposition to the genocide in Gaza, although a lot of journalists still refer to it as the war in Gaza, or even the war between Israel and Hamas. Some even go as far as to call it the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, which is definitely the most accurate of the three, but still undersells the reality of the situation by an order of magnitude. It's a genocide, carried out by a fascist apartheid regime. But that's an aside. The point is that reporting about Eurovision 2025 was framed by the opposition to the genocide in Gaza. As I said in last year's video, quote, the scale of the death and destruction taking place there is just too big and too horrible to cover up and ignore, end quote. That's the second time I've quoted myself. Am I a narcissist? And that's just become more and more obvious every single day to everyone except the EBU, it seems. Even disgusting, contrarian piece of garbage Piers Morgan has finally reached his limit for dead kids, apparently.
I have resisted going as far as you have done in your criticism of the Israeli government. I resist no more. I think we've reached common ground about what we view is happening and has been happening through this period of this blockade, which frankly is just starvation. If you look at what Smodrich has been saying, probably the most right-wing member of a very right-wing government, he is talking in a genocidal language about kicking all the Palestinians out.
The event that the EBU wanted to be about inclusivity and unity was instead about one of the worst atrocities of our lifetime. How could it not be, with the inclusion of the state that is carrying out a genocide before our very eyes? The EBU didn't just fight the press, but also the public, because, people have pretty strong opinions about genocide. Strange, right? Eurovision 2025, the actual show plucked out of its context, was a relatively clean event, aesthetically at least, compared to last year's clusterduck. It went pretty well. Good entertainment if you can ignore all the blood, but Eurovision does not exist in its own bloodless bubble. It exists in the same context as everybody else. And in that context, Israel is smearing blood all over the rubble of Gaza. So if you want to invite the genocide state to your apolitical event, you're going to get a lot of pushback, obviously. People are going to take to the streets and scream in your face that you support murder, and they're correct. Let's keep that in perspective, that the people accusing the EBU of supporting murder are correct. And if you are the EBU or the Swiss broadcaster that hosted the event and you want things to look nice and tidy, what do? Well, you get the cops to do your dirty work for you. During the grand final on Saturday, the 17th of May, the police used rubber bullets, fire hoses, and tear gas against protesters. Tear gas, by the way, is literally banned for use in warfare. It's an actual war crime to use it, but police sure have no qualms about using it to hurt protesters speaking out against genocide. Its short-term and long-term effects are poorly studied, but it can cause blindness, respiratory illnesses, and even death. Rubber bullets aren't much better. Let me just quote Wikipedia instead of myself for once. Quote, although they are considered a less lethal alternative to metal projectiles, rubber bullets can still cause fatal injuries as well as other serious injuries such as blindness or other permanent disabilities, end quote. There really isn't such a thing as a non-lethal weapon. That's not real. Non-lethal weapons just don't exist. All weapons can be lethal, and the police are just fine with that, maiming and killing in the name of a genocidal state. Kinda makes you wonder how they sleep at night. Like, do they think they did a good and positive thing and made the world better? That's kind of what I'm wondering about the EBU too. You know, let's get the police to violently suppress the protesters that oppose genocide just so we can be united by music with the state that's doing the genocide. Oh boy, we're making the world so much better. I feel like I should insert that MLK quote about positive peace versus negative peace here. The EBU's idea of unity and inclusivity is the negative peace, which is the absence of tension, instead of a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. They want a negative peace with Israel, which allows Israel to continue its genocide because it's normalized that it gets to do that, instead of a positive peace later that sees the liberation of the Palestinian people, because that positive peace later requires tension in the here and now, like kicking Israel out of Eurovision. And I'm not the only one that thinks that. In the weeks and months prior to the event, several of the participating countries asked for a discussion about Israel's inclusion in the event. The Spanish broadcaster was one of them, citing its concerns about what Israel is doing in Gaza. And during the second semifinal, the one in which Israel participated, a Spanish commentator brought up the death toll in Gaza ahead of Israel's performance. That got them in trouble with the EBU. They even got a letter that a person actually sat down to write, somehow without realizing that they're the villain. Let's take a look at that letter. Quote, on the 15th of May, during the live broadcast of the second semifinal of ESC 2025, your commentators referred to RTVE's request for a debate within Eurovision on Israel's participation and cited casualty figures from Gaza, including children. Please remember that all commentators must comply with the ESC rules and the commentator's handbook. These guidelines prohibit political statements that could compromise the contest's neutrality. Casualty figures have no place in an apolitical entertainment show whose slogan, United by Music, embodies our commitment to unity. It is essential that your commentators follow these rules without exception in tonight's dress rehearsal and in tomorrow's broadcast to preserve the ESC's non-political character and uphold the ethics, the fucking ethics, and standards set out in the rules. We count on RTV's full cooperation to prevent any recurrence. Any further breach may incur punitive fines under the rules. Thank you for your continued commitment to safeguarding the integrity of the Eurovision Song Contest. Kind regards, Buckle Walden, Martin Österdahl. End quote. Man, I don't think there's much integrity left, you know? Casualty figures, including children, have no place in an apolitical entertainment show whose slogan, United by Music, embodies our commitment to unity? Then maybe don't invite the fucking child murderers. Political statements, like citing facts, apparently, would compromise the contest's neutrality? They're fucking ghouls. These are ghoulish things to say, like at face value. Your commentators brought up the fact that a participating country is murdering children, and we feel this was very unfair to the child murderers. These people should be rotting in prison for their genocide-embracing unity. They should be forced to watch pictures of every single dead child until they no longer crave unity with the child-killing state. What even is this world? What are we doing here? Genuinely, where is the damn humanity? Well, Spain showed us where it was, because ahead of the grand final they displayed this message, quote, "When human rights are at stake, silence is not an option. Peace and justice for Palestine," end quote. Spain wasn't alone in calling for Israel to be excluded from the event, of course. Another example, one of many, is the open letter written by over 70 people who've previously participated in Eurovision, artists and songwriters and such. In the letter, they urged the EBU to exclude Israel. Quote, "We, the undersigned, former Eurovision participants, urge all members of the European Broadcasting Union to demand the exclusion of Khan, the Israeli public broadcaster, from the Eurovision Song Contest. Khan is complicit in Israel's genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza and the decades-long regime of apartheid and military occupation against the entire Palestinian people. We believe in the unifying power of music, which is why we refuse to allow music to be used as a tool to whitewash crimes against humanity. Last year, we were appalled that the EBU allowed Israel to participate while it continued its genocide in Gaza, broadcast live for the world to see. The result was disastrous. Rather than acknowledging the widespread criticism and reflecting on its own failures, the EBU responded by doubling down, granting total impunity to the Israeli delegation while repressing other artists and delegations, making the 2024 edition the most politicized, chaotic, and unpleasant in the competition's history. Silence is not an option. When authoritarian movements and the far right are on the rise around the globe, our duty to speak out has only become more pressing. We therefore join together to state that the EBU's complicity with Israel's genocide must stop. By continuing to platform their representation of the Israeli state, the EBU is normalizing and whitewashing its crimes. The EBU has already demonstrated that it is capable of taking measures, as in 2022 when it expelled Russia from the competition. We don't accept this double standard regarding Israel. We stand in solidarity with this year's contestants and condemn the EBU's repeated refusal to take responsibility. As singers, songwriters, musicians, and others who have had the privilege of participating in Eurovision, we urge the EBU and all its member broadcasters to act now and prevent further discredit and disruption to the festival. Israel must be excluded from Eurovision." End quote. That's a good-ass letter. So how did the EBU respond to this good-ass letter? Quote, "The EBU is an association of public service broadcasters, not governments, who are all eligible to participate in the Eurovision Song Contest every year if they meet the requisite requirements. It is not our role to make comparisons between conflicts. As part of its mission to secure a sustainable future for public service media, the EBU is supporting our Israeli member Khan against the threat from being privatized or shut down by the Israeli government." End quote. We'll get back to the bit about Eurovision being a competition for public service broadcasters and not governments in just a little bit, but first let's examine that part about requisite requirements. Because the lie here is that Russia was expelled because its public broadcaster didn't follow the rules, whereas the Israeli broadcaster supposedly does follow the rules, TM. It would be very convenient here if someone had compiled a Google document with all the ways Khan has broken the rules. Oh yeah, someone did, and it's linked right here in the open letter. It includes gems like, quote, "Khan shared a video of Israeli children singing 'We will annihilate everyone in Gaza,' end quote." Or, quote, "Khan's journalist gloats over the killing of Al Jazeera reporter Ismail al-Ghul, who was assassinated by Israeli occupation drones," end quote. Or how Khan called for the extermination of Nemo and Goethe during Eurovision 2024 by calling them Amalek, which quote, is described in the Hebrew Bible as the enemy of the nation of the Israelites, end quote, paired with this commandment, quote, to exterminate the seed of Amalek, end quote. What about when Khan commentators ridiculed Yust over his dad having died of cancer? That's kind of vile. Or, quote, during the filming of a genocide normalizing peace in Gaza, Major Bazalel Batit, deputy commander of the 931st Battalion, orders the murder of a Palestinian riding a bicycle, a war crime, on Khan's camera. I want to take this cyclist down, strike him, end quote. What the actual fuck? What about this one? I feel like it's relevant. Quote, the editor of the international news desk at Khan Reshet Bet Radio admits that the Eurovision Song Contest has long been more than just a musical event. It is a critical arena for Israeli advocacy, end quote. That almost sounded political. But surely it can't be, because Eurovision is apolitical. Surely a fascist apartheid state that is doing a genocide wouldn't use something like Eurovision as a political tool to sanitize its image and get away with its crimes, right? That would be against the rules, and the rules must be followed. Surely Israel would not break the rules. Those are but some examples of the horrible stuff in there, and that's definitely not a comprehensive list. Pause and read the rest if you're interested, but I think you get the gist. And this was before Eurovision 2025. Now you can add even more to the list. For example, a Khan commentator said racist things about Armenia during the broadcast. Oh hey, that's why I brought up Armenia earlier. After being called out for the racist comments, seemingly by everyone except the EBU, Khan issued the worst non-apology ever, perhaps second only to the one with the ukulele. Oh, this is gonna be painful. Quote, Eurovision broadcasts in Israel are traditionally accompanied by humorous and light-hearted commentary, during which the pair of commentators make funny and interesting observations about the song's performers and participating countries. During the second semifinal of Eurovision, commentators made direct, humorous comments, including about Armenia's song, as they do with almost all performances. One of the jokes in question, which was aimed solely at the song and not at the country or the Armenian people, inadvertently offended some members of the Armenian community. This was, of course, not entirely intentional. On the contrary, on several occasions, members of the Israeli delegation have highlighted the importance of the Armenian song and emphasized the warm relations between the two delegations. When we learned that the comment was perceived as an insult, the commenter who made the remark publicly apologized on his personal platform. Additionally, a clarification will be provided by the commentators on tonight's live broadcast. Khan, Israeli Public Broadcasting Corporation, sincerely apologizes for this humorous comment. We wish Parg and the Armenian team good luck during today's performance. Sincerely, some fascist dipshit, who cares? End quote. Literally, we're sorry that you were offended by our very humorous joke, bro. And the joke in question? Quote, I can't believe we gave these guys an entire quarter in Jerusalem. Survivor, that's how we feel after watching this song, end quote. A humorous, funny joke aimed solely at the song, and also these guys who aren't worthy a quarter in Jerusalem. I can't believe they actually officially issued this non-apology. Like, do they think Armenians are stupid? Or do they just not care? So, Khan, the Israeli broadcaster, has absolutely broken rules, both rules specific to Eurovision, but also in the sense that it is complicit in Israel's genocide in Gaza, as well as Israeli occupation of Palestinian land, and in upholding the Israeli system of apartheid. The Israeli broadcaster is just as complicit in Israel's crimes as the Russian broadcaster is in Russia's crimes. Oh, Oh, oh my god. Oh, it's even cuter now. I'm gonna take another picture of Sully and I'm gonna insert it here again. This is so precious. Actually, I'm just gonna do this. I'm gonna film here. Okay, I'm filming on my camera while I'm filming myself. Okay, let's see. Boom, 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 boom. Look at her. Look at her. Look at her. She's so adorable. I love her so much. She's the best. Hello, Sully. I feel like I dragged this out way too long. All right, let's continue with the video. Man, I need to cut my hair. So, this gets us to that dubious excuse the EBU loves to use, that Eurovision is not a competition between countries, but between public service broadcasters. I've shown that Khan absolutely has broken rules, so that excuse doesn't work, even if you accepted its logic, even if Eurovision were a competition between broadcasters and not governments. But the problem with that argument goes deeper than that, because it obviously isn't just a competition between broadcasters, or the artists wouldn't compete under the names and flags of nation states. Hey, Sully. She's here now. Wanna come up? She might come up. We'll see. You really cannot separate a country's government from its national broadcaster. Even in the best of cases, when the broadcaster operates independently, it is still an organ of the nation-state, a representative of the nation-state. You can't separate the two. Literally nobody thinks like that. Did you ever think, oh, this year Israel's national broadcaster Khan is competing? No, of course not. That's absurd, right? Israel competed, not its public service broadcaster. Participants in Eurovision compete as representatives of nation-states under the names and flags of nation-states. The participants themselves are not necessarily responsible for... Sully, I can't see what I'm supposed to say. I have like a script that's 13,000 words long. I can't memorize all of that, Sully, and you're in the way of the teleprompter. Let's see. The participants themselves are not necessarily responsible for or guilty of the crimes of the nation-states they represent as individuals, but in the capacity of participating in Eurovision, they act as representatives of nation-states. The same could be said of the broadcasters, that it's possible to pedantically argue that it's actually broadcasters that compete, not governments, but in the capacity of competing in Eurovision, under the names and flags of nation-states, they act as representatives of the nation-states. No amount of, actually, will erase this undeniable dynamic. Eurovision is a competition between nation-states. Back in 2022, Russia illegally invaded Ukraine after having illegally annexed Crimea in 2014 and subsequently backed and funded separatist groups in eastern Ukraine the following years. I have pretty strong opinions on this as a fellow European, as a citizen of a small European country that could easily fall prey to Russian expansionism, and of course, just as a human being. So I'm not too keen on unity with the Russian state. I don't want to be united by music with Putin or the Russian fascists who screech about how they need to eradicate the Ukrainian identity. And the EBU agrees with me on this, because Russia was excluded from Eurovision after its 2022 invasion. But for some reason, this is not the case with Israel, the fascist settler colonial state that had a system of apartheid and murdered Palestinians long before October 7th, 2023, and is now, of course, actively doing a genocide. That's strange that killing Ukrainians rightfully gets you booted out of Eurovision, but whether mass murdering Palestinians is right or wrong is a political question that the EBU doesn't want to weigh in on. And I mean, The logic underpinning that is that it could be okay to mass murder an oppressed minority. The EBU is saying that murdering Palestinians is up for discussion, just don't bring the discussion to Eurovision. Me? I don't think it's up for discussion. Mass murder can never be justified. Apartheid can never be justified. So Israel should have been expelled long before the genocide. That's literally how South African apartheid finally ended. Not by being kicked out of Eurovision, but through boycott, divestment, and sanctions. But the political will to do that just isn't there anymore, it seems. To sidestep the accusations of hypocrisy, the EBU therefore pretends that the competition where countries send artists to sing under their respective flags isn't a competition between countries, but between broadcasters. They kicked Russia out because the Russian broadcaster was bad, not because of the Russian invasion per se, or so they say, now. But back in 2022, the tune was very different. When Russia was excluded, the EBU referenced, quote, the unprecedented crisis in Ukraine, end quote, but made no mention of Russian state media breaking any rules. Instead, the concern was that, quote, the inclusion of a Russian entry would bring the competition into disrepute, end quote. I agree with that reasoning. Genocidal and warmongering regimes like Russia and Israel shouldn't be normalized in the spirit of unity. Whitewashing their crimes does in fact bring the competition into disrepute. Yet, this concern wasn't present with the inclusion of an Israeli entry, even after so many Palestinians have been brutally murdered, mostly children, by the way. I don't necessarily think pointing to hypocrisy is a good argument on its own, but it is quite damning when moral clarity was so perfectly present when white Europeans were victimized by Russia, still are of course Slavo-Ukraini, but not when brown Arabs are victimized by Israel. This points to a bias, a racist bias that shows just how dehumanized Palestinians are. This hypocrisy is not just hypocrisy, but a rejection of Palestinians as full and equal human beings. They're not worthy of the same consideration as Ukrainians are by the logic of the EBU. That is just racism. Beyond racism, actually, like genocidal racism. And this has certainly brought the competition into disrepute, all because of choices made and attitudes held by the EBU. As an addendum to what I just said, yes, I know that the EBU was initially reluctant to exclude Russia and that it changed its mind when several members threatened to withdraw from Eurovision, but the point remains that Russia was in fact expelled, and that happened promptly after the illegal 2022 invasion, and the reason the EBU gave for doing so was an ethical, political, prescriptive statement about the actions of the Russian state, not its broadcaster. When the EBU says that they can't kick out Israel because its broadcaster supposedly hasn't broken the rules, even though it clearly has, I say, yes, we can. Sorry, that was lame. Too lame to cut from the script, so I'm keeping it. Thanks, Obama. But let's move on to the next excuse the EBU loves to beat us over the head with. Year in and year out, over and over and over again, the EBU's favorite thing to say, other than the thing about the competition being between broadcasters, is that Eurovision is apolitical. They think that if they say it enough, it will eventually become true, I guess. I'm going to talk about that highly dubious claim in a little bit, but we really need to put the entire thing in its proper context, which you can't do without first talking about Israel and the political ideology of Zionism, because what Israel represents is what the EBU let them whitewash through their participation in Eurovision. So, I think the best place to start here is by saying that Zionism is not Judaism. Israel does not hold monopoly on Jewishness, and when I talk about Zionism here, I categorically do not mean Jews or Judaism. I mean the settler colonial political project of Zionism, which is supported by some far-right Jews for sure, but also by nearly every stripe of far-right extremist, perhaps by sheer numbers predominantly by Christian nationalists. Zionism is not a Jewish problem, it's a fascist problem. And the irony is that it is an anti-Semitic trope to equate Judaism and Jewishness with Zionism and Israel. It is pretty damn anti-Semitic to look at people condemning a genocide and calling them anti-Semites for it, as if the slaughter of children and decades of apartheid are immutable characteristics of Jews rather than the properties of a political ideology upheld by a state. A state that is, again, predominantly supported by Christian nationalists in the United States of America. Plenty of Jewish voices have spoken out against the state of Israel and what it is doing to Palestinians. Countless Jews have stood up and marched with Palestinian flags in opposition to the genocide. That includes people like Marian Ingram, a Jewish woman who survived the Holocaust. So let me say it again. Zionism is not the same as Judaism or Jewishness. No, Zionism is a fascist ideology that wraps itself in the aesthetics of Jewishness, in the same way that Nazism is a fascist ideology that wraps itself in the aesthetics of whiteness. I made this same point last year, so I want to take the opportunity to respond to an annoying comment. It's my channel, I get to air my grievances, okay? In response to this very point, some jackass said smugly, quote, "I don't know where you get Nazism is about whiteness, while it is about Aryanism and white Slavs are not in it. Also, most European fascists are not that pro-Israel as they are anti-Semitic. I'll pass all of this and come to point that Israel winning a song contest somehow being important. It would change nothing as Israel didn't lose ground in Gaza or stop illegal occupation after that. If you want change, then it should be by way of crippling IDF, but in that case, then Arabs will genocide them. Even though I don't support genocide, it is understandable why." End quote. What the fuck? Okay, when Nazis talk about Aryans, they mean white people. White is a social construct, and what it means has changed over time and in different political contexts. Irish people weren't considered white in the past. Some people might not consider Slavs white, when others do. Jewish people are sometimes considered white, sometimes not. It's all arbitrary bullshit. And yes, fascists are in fact anti-Semitic. Thanks for explaining that obscure fact to me. I definitely didn't know that before. But as I explained in the video this comment responded to, that doesn't stop them from supporting the apartheid ethno-state they want to model their apartheid ethno-state after. Also, a lot of fascists really hate Muslims and like it when they die. No, being kicked out of Eurovision won't immediately stop Israel from doing their genocide, but boycott, divestment, and sanctions is a tried and true path to bring down apartheid regimes. As long as Israel is treated as a normal state, they can get away with the genocide with impunity. Being excluded from Eurovision is but one small part of that, but it is still part of that. Also, the idea that liberation of an oppressed people is dangerous to the oppressor is a fascist myth. The idea that oppressed people would do the same thing if they were in power is a fascist myth. So get the fuck out of my comment section with that garbage. Thank you. Sorry, sometimes a man's just gotta rant, you know? To get back on track, I mean, I'm going to repeat myself now for like the 5th time, but it bears repeating. Israel is a fascist apartheid state that is doing a genocide right now, as recognized by every expert on fascism and genocide, and the United Nations, and by using your fucking eyes and ears, and also by Holocaust survivors. The State of Israel was founded on ethnic cleansing, the Nakba of 1948, when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were expelled from their homes and had their land stolen by a Western-backed and militant Zionist force. As with all injustices around the world, it can be traced back to the British, of course. Since then, Israel has continually stolen more land, year in and year out, established more illegal settlements. We could go through the whole thing, but it would probably kill the pacing of this already bloated video, which is becoming way too long. Certainly not helped by my tangents. The point is that history didn't begin on October 7th, 2023, and even if it did, Israel's genocidal actions still wouldn't be justified. There is no justification for Israel's genocide in Gaza. There can never be a justification for it. It's not possible to justify it. Murdering children by the tens of thousands can never be justified. Genocide can never be justified. The genocide in Gaza isn't a bilateral conflict with some unfortunate collateral damage of civilian infrastructure and loss of civilian life. It's a unilateral assault with total destruction and carnage on one side. It's not the least bit ambiguous. It's a Western-backed state with a modern military raining hellfire on an oppressed population that's trapped in what essentially is the world's largest concentration camp. Even before the genocide started, Israel controlled Gaza's borders, water, electricity, and coastline. You know, people like to talk about Hamas as if they're in charge of Gaza, but they're not. Well, they're in charge in the sense that they're the strongest prison gang, but political control of Gaza was always in the hands of Israel. It's not a conflict between two governments. It's a genocide perpetrated by a state against an oppressed minority within the borders of that state. A minority that was already subject to forced displacement, apartheid, and often outright murder before October 7th. That doesn't justify Hamas targeting civilians, but Hamas is irrelevant. It's a small actor compared to the Israeli state. It doesn't hold any power compared to the Israeli state. And the only reason an extremist group like Hamas even exists is because of the brutal oppression and occupation of the Palestinian people perpetrated by the Israeli state. You know, that whole thing about how if you make peaceful revolution impossible, you make violent revolution inevitable or something like that. The state of Israel has all the power, and it's using it to steal land and murder or expel the undesirables. At every turn, Israel has made sure that Palestinians, especially those in Gaza, have absolutely no peaceful path to liberation. So, yeah, that's a system designed to radicalize people, and in turn, that radicalization is an integral part of Israel's designs for the future, because that radicalization is a post hoc justification for the oppression they're already doing. The Israeli state was always the aggressor, but they point to the radicalization they caused with their aggression as a justification for the aggression and for further escalation. What the Israeli state is doing in Gaza now is what they always wanted to do. They just needed an excuse, something to point to that gets the world on their side. I want to share with you some brief snippets of an open letter that was published on July 25th, 2024. It was signed by 45 American doctors and nurses who volunteered in Gaza. So, first thing I want to do is thank these brave men, women, and possibly NBs for their heroic service. I can't think of any endeavor that requires more humanity and courage than to go into Gaza during a genocide at a time when healthcare providers and other humanitarian volunteers, as well as journalists, are being intentionally targeted and murdered by Israel. Quote, "We are among the only neutral observers who have been permitted to enter the Gaza Strip since October 7th. Given our broad expertise and direct experience, we believe we are well positioned to comment on the massive human toll from Israel's attacks on Gaza. It is likely that the death toll from this conflict is already greater than 92,000, an astonishing 4.2% of Gaza's population, with only marginal exceptions. Everyone in Gaza is sick, injured, or both. We saw widespread malnutrition in our patients and our Palestinian healthcare colleagues. We watched malnourished new mothers feed their underweight newborns infant formula made with poisonous water. We can never forget that the world abandoned these innocent women and babies. Israel's continued repeated displacement of the malnourished and sick population of Gaza, half of whom are children, to areas with no running water or even toilets available is absolutely shocking. We worry that unknown thousands have already died from the lethal combination of malnutrition and disease, and that tens of thousands more will die in the coming months. Most of them will be young children. Children are universally considered innocents in armed conflict. However, every single signatory to this letter treated children in Gaza who suffered violence that must have been deliberately directed at them. Specifically, every one of us on a daily basis treated preteen children who were shot in the head and chest. We wish you could see the nightmares that plague so many of us since we have returned. Dreams of children maimed and mutilated by our weapons and their inconsolable mothers begging us to save them. We wish you could hear the cries and screams our consciences will not let us forget. We cannot believe that anyone would continue arming the country that is deliberately killing these children after seeing what we have seen. We quickly learned that our Palestinian healthcare colleagues were among the most traumatized people in Gaza, and perhaps in the entire world. Like virtually all people in Gaza, they had lost family members and their homes. Most lived in and around their hospitals with their surviving families in unimaginable conditions. All were acutely aware that their work as healthcare providers had marked them as targets for Israel. This makes a mockery of the protected status hospitals and healthcare providers are granted under the oldest and most widely accepted provisions of international humanitarian law. We met healthcare personnel in Gaza who worked at hospitals that had been raided and destroyed by Israel. Many of these colleagues of ours were taken by Israel during the attacks. They all told us a slightly different version of the same story. In captivity, they were barely fed, continuously physically and psychologically abused, and finally dumped naked on the side of the road. Many told us they were subjected to mock executions and other forms of mistreatment and torture. Far too many of our healthcare colleagues told us they were simply waiting to die. Unquote. It's not the least bit ambiguous. Israel is currently engaged in a genocide. There is no other word to describe the horror that Israel has unleashed on innocent Palestinians in Gaza. It is a concerted effort to cause as much death and suffering as possible. The use of white phosphorus, indiscriminate bombing of population centers, targeted destruction of hospitals, targeted killings of journalists and aid workers, the blocking of humanitarian aid, systematic imprisonment and torture of innocent civilians in concentration camps, including children who have been sexually assaulted, sometimes even raped to death, and all this wrapped up in a neat bow of clear and conscious genocidal intent, incitement, and fervor by Israeli officials and media, like how they said they're fighting human animals, and that even the babies are terrorists.
אלה צריכים להיות מחוסלים. ביום שאחרי השבת כל החטופים הביתה, צריכים להמשיך את המלחמה, והיא תימשך. אין לי ספק שהיא תימשך. כי אי אפשר לחיות עם היצורים האלה לידינו. זה אזור, רצועת עזה, שתולה במחבלים. כל ילד שנולד עכשיו בדקה הזאת, הוא מחבל מראש, איך שהוא נולד.
Israel's onslaught in Gaza is truly one of the greatest evils of our time, and it's happening now after decades of old-school colonialism and apartheid. It is just absolutely unconscionable. Words aren't enough. In this context, the EBU made the choice to let Israel compete in Eurovision, a music competition meant to unite the world. Not once, but twice they did that. That is itself a political action, even if the EBU refuses to recognize it as such, instead framing it as not really taking a side, not bringing the politics into it. The EBU uses the excuse that Eurovision is apolitical to justify their decision to let Israel participate. Quote, "It is not our role to make comparisons between conflicts." End quote. But that excuse doesn't work because that is in itself a political statement, ironically. Let me explain what I mean. United by music, the slogan used for Eurovision, is a political statement. What if I don't want to be united with the genocidal, child-murdering state? What then? That's a political disagreement. That's all politics is, right? Politics is disagreement. Obviously, there's a lot more to it about power and stuff, but in a somewhat reductionist sense, that's what politics is. disagreement. So the EBU is making a political statement by including Israel, but is trying to avoid accountability for that statement by defining it as apolitical. You might now be asking me, Pat, what political statement is the EBU making? That genocide is an acceptable disagreement, that there are two equally valid sides to genocide. I just don't think genocide can ever be acceptable. There isn't a political conversation there with two equally valid sides. But what the EBU says by allowing Israel to participate in Eurovision is that yes, actually, it is equally valid to be for and against genocide. That's a reasonable disagreement to have, according to the EBU. The problem the EBU has is that they believe they can step out of the context in which they exist and host Eurovision in some sort of alternate reality without politics. But that's just not how the world works. Demanding to be apolitical is the same as rolling around on the floor crying about how you don't want to be part of the world. I'm sorry, but that's not up to you. Apolitical and neutral are imaginary concepts, especially in the face of genocide. It's an idealized fantasy. Everything is political, at least everything about which people disagree. The choices we make or don't make shape the world around us inevitably, unavoidably, whether we like it or not. Not making a choice is making a choice. Not taking a side is taking a side, especially when one side is so obviously and egregiously wrong. You can't escape that by pretending to be apolitical. To prove my point beyond a reasonable doubt, Eurovision has for a long time been an explicitly queer affair. It's a music festival that welcomes you as you are, gay, trans, non-binary, finery, whatever. In a world that so often dehumanizes queer people and even tries to eradicate them, just because of who they are, that inclusivity, that acceptance, is a political statement, a good one. It shouldn't be a political statement. It should just be the norm that it's okay to be yourself, but because of queerphobic bigots that leverage political power to erase queer people from public life, it is undoubtedly a political statement. Nothing can ever be apolitical as long as the existence of certain demographics of people is treated as political by some political factions. Currently, there are political factions that want to erase gay people, trans people, and non-binary people. There are political factions that want to erase brown and black people. There are political factions that want to erase Jewish people. And there is certainly a faction that wants to erase Palestinians. And the EBU helped them do so this year as well as last year by treating Israel as just another country and pretending its politics, i.e. the genocide, are within the scope of acceptable, reasonable disagreement. Previously, the EBU has chosen to be pro-LGBTQ and feminist because they've decided that queerphobia and misogyny, albeit political, exist outside the spectrum of acceptable disagreement. So, by the same logic, the EBU has decided that genocide exists within the spectrum of acceptable disagreement. What it comes down to, in the end, is not whether Eurovision should or should not be political, but rather in what way it should be political. Inclusiveness, tolerance, and multiculturalism are no-brainers in my mind, but peace, anti-apartheid, and anti-genocide should also be absolute no-brainers. These are all things that shouldn't be political, but the fact is that they are. So the choice before us is whether to be on the right or wrong side of history, and the EBU is choosing the wrong side again and again, even if it tries to frame that decision as a neutral one. Last year, there was a poignant post on the hell site that used to be called Twitter that said, quote, "If y'all have ever wondered what you would have done during the Holocaust, you're doing it right now," end quote. That's exactly right, and the EBU let the genocidal regime participate in the spirit of unity at the expense of everyone else, especially at the expense of the Palestinians whose blood is being washed away by Eurovision's normalization of Israel. When the EBU claims that it wants Eurovision to be apolitical, all I can think is, how can you watch a population be subjected to the kind of barbaric violence that the people in Gaza experience every single day and just not care, not have an opinion on it? Are Palestinians really that far beneath your consideration, that far removed from even being viewed as people? The EBU's policy of see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil doesn't really work when everyone is bombarded with news stories and images of dead children every single day, which is why so many people, myself included, adamantly insist that Israel should not be allowed to participate in Eurovision. You might also wonder, why does Israel even want to compete when most everyone hates them? I've already touched on that a little bit, but to further expand on that, fascists use such things as Eurovision as vehicles for their propaganda, primarily to normalize their politics and sanitize their image. That is, after all, what lets them get away with it. Israel is able to be an apartheid state and carry out its genocide because the rest of the world permits it. It would be much harder to do it without support from and financial ties to the rest of the world. So, Israel has a vested interest in spreading propaganda that helps them go through with the genocide and projecting an image of acceptance and normalcy. Part of that is also about rallying their supporters and giving them a channel through which to show support, which will become clear in the next section of this video essay when I talk about the voting results. With the inclusion of Israel in the competition, Eurovision was never going to be apolitical and will never be apolitical because Israel's very incentive to participate was political and will continue to be political. The people who are opposed to genocide were never going to let that happen without resistance and will never let that happen without resistance. And the people who support Israel, primarily the far right, weren't going to let that resistance happen without counter-resistance and will never let that resistance happen without counter-resistance. By including Israel, the EBU turned Eurovision into a culture war battleground that the far-right could use to push narratives and propaganda, and that will continue to be the case until Israel is kicked out. In its desire to depoliticize genocide, the EBU twisted Eurovision into the most political monstrosity imaginable. I watched the Swedish broadcast, of course, because I am Swedish, and I do want to highlight a comment made by Swedish commentator Edvard af Sillén during the second semifinal, right before Israel's performance. He said, translated from Swedish, quote, "The EBU has always maintained that Eurovision is apolitical, but Israel's presence makes it impossible to think only about the music," end quote. So, with that said, let's talk about the voting results. Austria managed to eke out a desperate but well-deserved victory in large part because of jury points, while Israel comfortably sailed to the top with the most points by far from the voting public, 297 points, including more 12-pointers than any other country. Now, here's a good spot in the video to tell you that the night of the Eurovision 2025 Grand Final, Israel murdered over 140 people, including many children. It's almost as if they got points for every child they murdered. That's the reality of the situation, and it was obvious that it was going to play out like that, simply based on last year's fiasco that produced a similar result. And it'll be like that next year too, assuming the EBU hasn't grown a spine and kicked out the child murderers by then, although that seems unlikely. This fragile and very political situation will continue either until Eurovision breaks under the weight of its own self-imposed fake neutrality, or until Israel is either kicked out or outright wins, which would likely destroy Eurovision, by the way. Like last year, the results have sparked a lot of discourse, of course. Given how much noise the pro-Palestinian crowd is making, given how we're inundated with news of dead children on a near-daily basis, you'd think Israel shouldn't win the popular vote, but Israel did win the popular vote. Looking at the results, one could come to the conclusion that Israel is more popular than it seems. So, is that the case? Is Israel just very popular in Europe? Well, no. I mean, views are definitely mixed, certainly not helped by a media landscape that is overly sympathetic to Israeli narratives and propaganda and presents a beautified version of what Israel is and does. Every single news story that I see here in Sweden about Israel's genocide in Gaza still at this late date refers to it as a war between Israel and Hamas, claims that Hamas started it on October 7th, ignoring the decades of history prior to that terrorist attack, ignores the power dynamics and really the power imbalance between the Israeli state and the oppressed Palestinian people, and a whole bunch of things like that. Even something as simple as using the language of terrorism when speaking about Hamas murdering 1,500 Israelis, and then switching to language of war and proportionality when speaking about Israel murdering tens or even hundreds of thousands, mostly children. When Israel bombs to death tens of thousands of Palestinians, it's war, not terrorism. When Israel is on the verge of starving to death hundreds of thousands more, that's an unfortunate humanitarian crisis, not a genocide. Pervasive and powerful subtleties in the language used to report on what's going on. Yet, despite that god-awful framing by the media, views about Israel lean significantly more to the negative, and that's an ongoing trend that continues with every news story about starving children in Gaza, regardless of the framing. Given just how evil what Israel is doing actually is, public opinion in Europe is far too ambivalent, in my opinion, but there's no pro-Israeli silent majority that represents the true European people. Israel did very well with the public vote, but it's all smoke and mirrors. It's an illusion. It's completely fake. The vote is inflated by political support from a relatively small group of people with a vested interest in showcasing support for Israel. The political actor with the most interest in this is, of course, the State of Israel itself that uses Eurovision to whitewash its image. In furtherance of this goal, Israel ran ads telling people to vote for the Israeli entry, which is probably against the rules, against undue influence of the results, but has been declared okay by EBU dumbass Martin Green. These ads, paid for by the Israeli state, even appeared on the official Eurovision livestream. And remember, you can vote up to 20 times.
Foreshadowing is a literary.
What's interesting is that Israel actually did slightly worse this year than last year, yet finished in a better position. 297 points from the public and finishing second in 2025 versus 323 points from the public and finishing fifth in 2024. But I think that's because there wasn't really any song that stuck out and claimed a lot of the points this year, unlike last year when both Nemo and Baby Lasagna dominated the scoreboard. Points were distributed more sporadically this year, which pulled down Israel's total score a little bit because of how the system works. I'll explain that in a few moments. But also put it in a better position to win because everyone else got fewer points, or the entries at the top got fewer points and the ones at the bottom got more points compared to last year. Following the nail-biting grand final this year, during which it looked like Israel would win until the very last moments when Austria climbed ahead, there have been calls to investigate cheating and also to rethink the system as a whole. For example, the Spanish broadcaster RTVE has, quote, raised concerns that the current televoting model may be ill-suited to times of armed conflict where geopolitical tensions could sway results, end quote. I don't necessarily think the cheating thing will pan out, because I don't necessarily think there was any cheating as such, except perhaps the ads Israel ran, of course, but the system itself is ripe for technically legal abuse. To understand why, it is imperative to understand how the system even works. So let's talk about that. The first thing to know is that the voting system in Eurovision kind of sucks. The EBU insists that it's great and awesome, and they vet all the votes or something to make sure things are as they should be. But the problem really isn't illegitimate votes so much as it is the total amount of votes and how points are distributed. Getting the most points suggests getting most votes, but the voting system is quite counterintuitive. Just like the international juries, each country has different set values to hand out: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, and 12. And the 25 other countries you can vote for compete for these points. This means two things. For one, only the top 10 out of the 25 entries get any points at all, while the remaining 15 get 0. And for two, it means that the difference in votes between the entries doesn't need to be very significant at all. To get a country's 12-pointer, you just need to have the highest number of votes out of all 25 entries, even if the difference is just a single vote. To illustrate what I mean, let's do a thought experiment. Assume that all entries get the same number of votes. Because you can't vote for your own country, that means that each of the 25 entries you can vote for gets 4%. Okay, now for one of those 25 entries to get the 12-pointer, they would only need one additional vote in this scenario. In other words, it is hypothetically possible to get the highest points with just 4.000001% of the vote. Do I think that's what happened? No, probably not, but I find it highly unlikely that Israel got an actual majority of the vote or anywhere near. That's the first problem with the voting system, that the points don't necessarily represent the actual share of the vote. So, entries that get 0 points don't necessarily get 0 votes or anywhere near. They just need to be in the bottom 15 in every country. And countries that get the majority of the points don't necessarily get the majority of the votes. They just need to have the largest share, even if the difference is very small. This gets us to the second problem, which is the fact that you can vote up to 20 times, or even more if you just use a different phone number or credit card or whatever. That might at face value not sound like it should be a problem, because everyone can vote up to 20 times. But the issue therein lies in exactly what the Spanish broadcaster said, that it's, quote, ill-suited to times of armed conflict where geopolitical tensions could sway results, end quote. That's because most people might not vote at all, or maybe a handful of times, often for different songs they like, but with the inclusion of a country like Israel that enjoys political support from a highly militant subsection of society, primarily fascists, you have people who vote specifically for this one entry the full 20 times or more for entirely political reasons. That means that most people spread out their votes, whereas militant right-wing agitators concentrate their votes on Israel. And that means that a relatively small group of people could sway the results massively. Whatever percentage of votes Israel received, it undoubtedly received a much lower percentage of voters. Given all this, Israel's high result is not at all unexpected, but the silver lining is that it doesn't indicate the massive popular support it implies. In a country like Sweden, where I'm from, with 10 million people, it wouldn't take a lot of cringe reactionaries politically voting for Israel 20 times to skew the results. Eurovision is pretty popular here, so around 2.5 million people watched it. Hypothetically, if those people voted at least once, let's say twice on average, that'd be 5 million votes spread across 25 entries. That's an average of 200,000 votes per song. Now let's say just 10,000 weird fascists, i.e. 0.1% of the population, used all 20 of their votes on Israel to signal political support. That's 200,000 votes for Israel, equal to the average number of votes per song in this hypothetical scenario. Easily enough to skew the results significantly, with just 0.1% of the population. If instead of 0.1%, just 1% did this, in other words, 100,000 people, that would be 2 million votes for Israel. What I'm saying is, it really is not very hard to imagine a scenario in which Israel won the popular vote by a landslide because of a small minority of voters, specifically obsessed reactionary losers who love that Israel is murdering brown kids. The Israeli entry this year, like last year, acted as a lightning rod for Zionists and other fascists to publicly display their support for Israel and, by extension, the genocide in Gaza. Because of the political circumstances, voting for Israel in Eurovision became for a lot of people, or rather for a minority of far-right weirdos, a vice signal. And because of how the voting system works, as I just explained, this relatively small group of fascists could easily sway the results. Are there normies out there who voted for the Israeli entry because they thought it was a decent song and they don't care enough about dead children halfway across the globe to abstain? Probably, almost certainly. But the reason Israel's boring song finished so strong is, without a doubt, because of the political vote of a minority of fascists that view the endeavor as a battle in the culture war. Again, I'd like to reiterate that this is not a Jewish problem, but a fascist problem. The majority of the vote for Israel likely came predominantly from non-Jewish fascists who have a vested political interest in elevating Israel. A few reasons why they might want to do that are Islamophobia, obviously, a strong historic support for Israel as a vital part of the American empire, of which Europe historically has been a part as well up until like January 20th, 2025, idealization of Israel as a model for an ethno-state, and the Christo-fascist belief that the end times, Armageddon, can only happen while Israel is under Jewish control. Hey, Miffles. Miffles is lying here on the floor. For many on the far right who subscribe to an inherently irrational ideology, support for Israel is just about contrarianism. As I said, it's a vice signal. Exactly why the right supports Israel despite obvious human rights abuses and genocide is not important right now anyway, but the fact that they do is vital to understand the results. I haven't exactly done any large-scale studies to prove this, but last year I did collect a large number of tweets of far-right people and Zionists bragging about how they voted 20, 40, 60, or 100 times for Israel. I've seen a couple of tweets like that this year too, like this one for example. But I also haven't been looking because I don't go on Twitter very much these days, you know, ever since it became the Nazi site. So I'm sure there's more where that came from, more people proudly puffing out their chests and proclaiming that the people in Europe actually love Israel, but also that they personally voted 20 times or more, you know, loser behavior, in the same breath claiming that there's overwhelming support for Israel and disproving their own claim by illustrating just why Israel's points were massively inflated. They've deluded themselves into believing that the results are an accurate representation of popular opinion somehow, despite, by their own admission, voting 20 times, 40 times, 60 times, or more. There wasn't, however, a Palestinian entry to be an anti-Zionist lightning rod, and anti-Zionists probably weren't all that likely to even vote. And insofar as they did vote, insofar as anyone voted, they spread their votes across the remaining 25 entries instead of just the one. This to me strongly suggests that the public support for Israel as seen in the voting results is an illusion, especially as most people who aren't rabidly pro-Israel probably did not vote the full 20 times, you know, because they're not losers. After the results were published in Sweden, numerous articles have popped up writing about how the people in Sweden voted for Israel with absolutely none of the context I just provided. Not just right-wing blogs, but reputable news outlets, just uncritically reporting on the results and how the Swedish people voted for Israel, without a hint of context or explanation. Nothing about how the voting system works, or that a bunch of people bragged about voting 20 times or more. Nothing about how it would be enough that a small minority of people voted 20 times with intentionality for Israel for the results to be massively skewed. So don't look at the results and lose hope. These results are meaningless without access to more information, such as the total number of votes and average number of votes from the same phone number for each contestant. I promise you, Israel's average number of votes from the same phone number was significantly higher than for any other country. Further proof of this is the absolutely hilarious fact that despite getting the most points from the voting, nobody actually listens to Israel's song. It is struggling to even make it onto the charts because its support was just completely and utterly fake. Obviously, it's number one in Israel, but outside of Israel, it's just not doing all that well. Whereas Espresso Macchiato, which finished second in the public vote, has made it onto way more charts at way better positions and has significantly more streams on Spotify. The real damage here isn't that this is proof of Israel's secret popularity, but that it is a propaganda win for Israel. So, with that in mind, let's talk about the legacy of Eurovision 2025. But what do you even say? Western governments, Western media, and the EBU are all complicit in the genocide, which plainly was a genocide from the very beginning, certainly almost 2 years later. The first ever live-streamed genocide. There are so many photos and videos online of children reduced to skin and bone through starvation, of children blown apart, body parts scattered everywhere, of children who have been shot in the head and babies killed for sport, of children who have lost limbs, often more than one, of aid workers, healthcare personnel, and journalists deliberately targeted by bombs or snipers. Everything is destroyed: schools, libraries, mosques, churches, universities, hospitals, workplaces, homes. There's hardly a building left standing in Gaza. As Owen Jones has said, Gaza is now a different color as seen from space. Over 50,000 Palestinians have been murdered, minimum, and many experts think that is probably an undercount. I think that's probably an undercount. I wouldn't be surprised if the real number is in the hundreds of thousands, and it goes up every day. Every day, Israel starves more people to death. Every day, Israel explodes more people to death. Just so much blood. Will we ever find all the bodies buried under the rubble? Will we ever realize the true scale of the horror Israel has wrought? All the people who wasted away into nothing. All the people whose last moments in life were nothing but suffocating darkness underneath tons of rubble. All the people whose limbs were blown off and who then bled out in the sand. All this savagery, and it's not yet beyond the pale for the EBU. The EBU can look at the genocidal violence and listen to Israel's explicit calls for genocide and still conclude that it's not beyond the pale. After Israeli officials called Palestinians human animals and claimed even the babies are terrorists that need to be annihilated. When is enough finally enough? What has never been clearer is that it's not possible to be apolitical in a political world. You can't step out of the context in which you exist, and it's certainly not possible to be neutral in the face of genocide. Watching a genocide happen in real time and deciding not to take a side is to take the side of the murderers, the side of genocide. Eurovision, same as all of us, exists in a world where the state of Israel is murdering scores of children right now, as I'm recording this video, probably as you're watching it, but that depends on when you come across my channel, I suppose. The EBU will never achieve unity through music while being willfully ignorant of this fact. Instead, they provide a platform for fascists to whitewash the image of Israel by voting for them 20, 40, 60, or 100 times, thereby inflating the perceived popular support for the regime and providing false credibility to the idea that what Israel is doing is in any way, shape, or form okay, when it very clearly isn't. Eurovision is failing to meet this moment, and that will be remembered when we look back at this pivotal period of history. Future generations will not look kindly at the cowardly complicity of our supposedly free and democratic institutions. They'll ask how so many of us could be so silent when the atrocities were so apparent, the bloodstains so thick, the bodies so many. And there will be no excuse to point to, nowhere to hide. We were neutral, won't cut it when juxtaposed against the dismembered bodies of children. Those of us who choose to be blind to the atrocities will have to own that. I fear the bloodstain this is leaving on Eurovision's legacy won't be easy to wash out. The fascists who mass voted for Israel won't stick around because they don't really like Eurovision, the music festival that is usually so woke, that celebrates women, LGBTQ people, and diversity. But because of the EBU's atrocious decision-making and downright genocidal complicity, this particular year, just like last year, they could use Eurovision as a vehicle for their hateful Islamophobic pro-genocide politics. And this has completely and utterly broken Eurovision. How could it not? How does Eurovision move forward with any kind of integrity and moral authority after bending itself out of shape to include a state engaged in genocide? Any perceived moral high ground that was previously held by our free democratic and inclusive Western institutions, including the EBU and Eurovision, has been completely wiped away by the pervasively implicit and oftentimes explicit support for Israel and its supposed right to defend itself against the scores of children it is currently murdering. I want to go back to the tweet I quoted before because it was so well put. If you've ever wondered what you would have done during the Holocaust, you're doing it now. It is that bad. Israel's genocidal actions toward Palestinians are that bad. This is what the EBU led into Eurovision 2 years in a row. The sick irony of it all is that the EBU claims it wants to bring people together, unite the world through music, but instead all it manages to do is render human life dirt cheap. Or at least certain human lives. The EBU is implicitly saying that Palestinians are not worth standing up for. They're not worthy of our consideration and concern. I do genuinely think this is in large part just racism, pure and simple. The EBU is a racist institution, and the people who run it, like Martin Green and Martin Österdahl, are racists who are just fine with brown kids being murdered halfway across the globe. But then there's also a second piece of the puzzle, which is Eurovision's major Israeli sponsor, Moroccan Oil. That's not very apolitical, is it? It is absolute insanity to have a major sponsor from a, to say the least, controversial country that is currently engaged in a genocide and has a long history of applying political pressure to anyone and anything that dares question or oppose its politics. It is a massive conflict of interest that undermines Eurovision's supposed apolitical neutrality, and perhaps this is, at least in part, an explanation as to why the EBU is so permissive toward Israel. This is perhaps the first and biggest thing that needs to change. The EBU and Eurovision should not accept money from regimes doing genocide and silencing critics. Full stop. But honestly, is there even any saving the EBU at this point? I feel like the legacy the EBU has created for itself has forever damaged its credibility. Hell, I think the people who run it should probably be put in prison for the role they've played in legitimizing Israel's genocide. As for Eurovision, this is a stain on its legacy so repugnant that the stench of it can never be fully removed. Israel is smearing blood all over the rubble of Gaza, the blood of babies, children, women, and men, innocent civilians, but also the blood of aid workers, United Nations personnel, doctors, nurses, EMTs, and more journalists than in any other conflict. The EBU's decision to let Israel come into its house and put its feet up in that nice white couch of perceived civil morality and tolerance, while drenched in all this blood, may just leave a stain so deep it can never be washed out. But if Eurovision is ever to move forward and be the festival of love and inclusivity that it should be, it needs to be without the child murderers and without the EBU that enable them. Martin Green, the director of Eurovision, wrote a tone-deaf open letter about how they're totally listening to feedback, but also everyone who criticizes, for example, the voting system is wrong, blah blah blah. Not a single mention of the genocide, though. They're never going to learn. If they don't understand by now why Israel's genocide is wrong when it's so obviously starving little kids, they will never learn. They just are genocidal racists. That's what they are at this point. They just are the type of people who are okay with genocide if it's done to the right people, by the right people. And I don't see that changing. Member broadcasters are putting more pressure on the EBU, like for example Slovenia that is considering pulling out of Eurovision unless serious steps are taken to resolve the issues, primarily Israel's participation. In an open letter, oh so many open letters, the Slovenian broadcaster stated, quote, "If the EBU does not take concrete steps and address the issues, we will consider our participation in future Eurovision events. We will be forced to do so if the EBU continues to fail to address these key issues from both an ethical and public interest perspective," end quote. So I guess the hope is that the EBU buckles under all the pressure, but we must never forget their complicity in the genocide. Never. I was going to title this video essay Eurovision 2025 was another unmitigated disaster, in line with my video on last year's Eurovision, titled Eurovision 2024 was an unmitigated disaster. But I don't think it was a disaster this year. Instead, Eurovision 2025, removed from its context, was kind of clean and good. And I think in the grand scheme of things, that's actually worse. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of children lie dead in the rubble of Gaza. Their murderer was once more welcomed into the fold, but this time without much visible disruptive friction. Eurovision became something worse than an unmitigated disaster this year. It became propaganda. Man, I can't wait to vote for my favorite public service broadcaster next year. That's a joke. I've never voted in Eurovision, and I never will. Unless there's a Palestinian entry, then I'll vote for that 100 times from 5 different phones. You better believe it. Thanks for watching. If you have any thoughts, share in the comments below. Also, someone tell me why every video I make ends up being at least twice as long as I intended. I sure know how to bloat a script. This was my longest one yet at over 13,000 words. Someone, apparently Shakespeare I googled, once said that brevity is the soul of wit. Remember to like and subscribe. If you like my content, you can help me make more by supporting me on Patreon or by becoming a channel member right here on YouTube. And I'll see you in the next bloated video. Eurovision 2020. Blah. Even though they banned artists from carrying the Plaid. What is the Plaid flag? But the EBU is destroying it by about on the 15s of 15s. Like, hey Miffles.